Good morning. Let's try that again. Good morning, everybody. This is great. Y'all look good from here. If we could go ahead and settle in. Grab some refreshments in the back. Some of those muffins. I haven't had one yet, but I plan on having one. All right. And there's a lot of empty seats here in the front. You guys are welcome to come up close. All right. Good morning. It's so good to have you guys here. I know that this has been a highly anticipated alumni reunion. I'm very, very excited to have you guys here. It's great to see those of you who I know, and I look forward to getting to know those of you who I don't know. My name is Tim Florian. I'm the director of the Alumni Association here. And I just wanted to, before we start, talk about a couple of things, a few housekeeping items. First, well, you guys have already got the refreshments, so that's good. Also, I just ran into Father Jeremy in the hallway. He asked me to make an announcement. Anybody that would like to sing tomorrow, if you got a good singing voice, tomorrow for the alumni mass, he's asking if you could meet him in the Abbey Church at 2:30, and that's open to anybody. Okay, if you have a good singing voice, if your spouse has a good singing voice, come on over. The other thing is, you'll notice this t-shirt that I'm wearing, and there's a few other people wearing this alumni reunion t-shirt. Some of you guys have been asking about it. But basically, if you see this t-shirt, that's somebody you can go to, and we're more than happy to help you out with whatever you need. This is basically a billboard saying, hey, I can help you, and welcome, again, still. So anyways, I've said enough, but like I said, I look forward to getting to know you guys, and I'm going to go ahead and invite Dr. Tony Bonta up here, who will give this morning's introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Good morning. My name is Tony Bonta, as Tim said, college class of 1987, and it's my privilege to also be a member of the Alumni Board of Directors. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our presenter this morning, Father Denis Robinson. Father Denis is a graduate of St. Meinrad College and School of Theology. He was ordained to the priesthood for the Diocese of Memphis in 1993, where he served for 3 years before joining the St. Meinrad monastic community. Since 2008, Father Denis has served as the president rector of St. Meinrad Seminary and School of Theology. In May of this year, Father Denis was appointed to a fourth 5-year term in that position, beginning in the 2023-2024 school year. His presentation this morning is entitled, Dear God, Are You Here? Finding God in Troubled Times. Join me, please, in giving Father Denis a warm welcome.
Well, good morning, everyone. I also want to reiterate Tim's welcome to everyone. It's great. This is the first kind of full-scale, you're going to have to keep moving it, right, Jim? You might as well just stand behind it. It's like, or hold it on your shoulder or something. The first full-scale reunion we've had in 3 years. So welcome back. We're glad to have you here. This is always one of the most exciting and interesting times of the year because it's great to see how old everyone is getting and how young I remain, and Tony, who I am amazed still looks so young. because he graduated 2 years before I did. Anyway, it doesn't matter. And so welcome back. Welcome. We're glad to have you. The topic of my presentation today is one that I have been thinking about for some time. It's something that I think we're also very much engaged with as we move into our new formation year. And I'll just say a little bit about our new formation year coming up in just a few weeks. The seminarians will be returning. We have a huge class this year. As you've noticed, we are currently renovating 2 buildings, St. Anselm Hall, which I felt a little kind of nostalgic about because St. Anselm Hall was opened during my first year in theology, and now it needs to be renovated, but I'm not getting a renovation. I don't know, it's very odd. But it's getting renovated, and all of that's offline now until fall of next year. Likewise, the library. I didn't know if you noticed it, but we put a bird cage on top of the library. It's going to be lovely with all those birds in it. No, it's going to have a roof. And you're like, why didn't it have a roof 40 years ago? Well, that's a question. So, and it's not good when the library roof leaks because then the books get wet. Not that anybody reads the books, but they're not good for them to get wet. So a lot going on here, so we have a lot less room than we usually have in terms of housing for students. And so we have the largest enrollment, the largest new percentage of students we've had in 40 years. I know that sounds kind of odd, but 40 years ago, we had a record number of people who were coming in to the seminary, and this year it is a new record. Not the highest enrollment we've had, but the highest number of new students. And this is because, I don't know why this is, but it's a lot to do with several things. And so if you come to the State of the School talk tomorrow, I'll try to explain a little bit about the 115 plus students who are coming next year. But we have no room at all. We have completely filled all of our rooms. And so that's a very important kind of thing to take into consideration. We have no more rooms to spare. So tomorrow you'll learn more about that. But today, the question, of course, is one that I think is on many people's minds today. Not only people that may not be as connected to the church as we are, most of us, but also people that are very connected to the church. And I think the past couple of years have really called us to ask some very critical questions about our faith. And so I want to look a little bit at today at those questions, but then a little bit toward the idea of how we might renew our faith. And then at the end, we'll have time for some questions. And I will just tell you, just by way of disclosure, that I am just over a bout of COVID. It was very interesting. I've been vaccinated like 8 times. I get extra vaccinations. And then I got COVID. It's like, okay, whatever. But I didn't really even know that I had it. I only had a suspicion because I had a cold. And I thought, I better get tested. And I did. And look at me now. I mean, but anyway, if I faint, just leave. That's always the best. So let's look at the question. The times in which we live. The times in which we live. Now, I don't know, I suspect, I don't know, that those who are kind of heavily involved in the daily life of parishes and church may have a very particular perspective on this. I don't know, but I also think that the times in which we live are talking about, we're talking about not only in the church, but really kind of in the larger sphere of things. And one thing I've noted in my investigations of church life through the years has been that there are very few trends in church life that aren't also trends in the larger culture. And there are very few trends in the larger culture that are not also trends in church life. And so when we're talking about things in the church, we can also talk about things on a much larger scale as well. And so I would look at three kind of ideas that we can investigate looking at the times in which we live. One is trouble in the world, one is trouble in the church, and the third is trouble in ourselves. So let me just start by reflecting a little bit on each one of these, because I think that sets the tone for what I hope to do today. First of all is trouble in the world. And I don't think, here's what I think. I don't think that there are many things going on in our world today that haven't been going on for a long time, maybe hundreds of years, maybe more. In other words, I think that a lot of the things that we see in our world today are things that we might have observed also in the past. But we have become much more aware of them in our time because of the nature of the culture in which we live, which is a seemingly communicative culture. And I would use the example of the Ukraine war. You know, in the 18th century or 17th century, there might have been a war in Ukraine, and we would have never known about it. In other words, lots of things could have happened in that region of the world, but we would have never known about it. Now we have a daily update, sometimes 10, about what's happening in Ukraine. And we look at that, and we're kind of appalled by that, but we also see that it's a serious situation, but I would say it was one that years ago, many years, we would have had no knowledge of. And that's an important thing for us to remember. Not that that was a better thing, but it was just a different thing. And in looking at Ukraine, one of the things I think that is very important, let me just give you an anecdote because I was very happy about it. When the war broke out earlier this year, we had several students that came to me and said, we would like to do a collection among the seminarians for Ukraine. And I thought, okay, I'm going to tell you this. I'm just going to say it. You can mute that part out. I'm just going to say it. Seminarians are wonderful people. They're not the most generous people when it comes to financial contributions. And you might suspect this is true since most of them live on an income of like 4 cents a year. And so, but they're not particularly generous. And so the fellow came to me and he said, why don't we take up a collection for Ukraine? And so I had him do the research. He and the other group of people in our stewardship committee, they came back to me and said, this is what we'd like to do. We'll take up the collection, we'll send the funds to this group in Ukraine who are helping refugees. I said, okay. I was not very, what should I say? No, none of that. I was none of that. We also decided to ask our overseers to help participate in this, and I didn't know where that was going to go. You know, you never know these days with political questions, you know, who's going to be interested, who's not. So I thought, we might get $1,000. I would like it if we could get 1,000, that would be lovely. The final collection turned out to be $25,000. And I'm like, they have hidden money. The next time we have a fire drill, I'm going through their rooms. We call that development in the seminary world. But, you know, we would have not thought about that several hundred years ago. The other thing, though, that I think is very interesting about the news cycle is precisely that. It's a cycle. And it's interesting to me how Ukraine can become a very important issue one week, and 2 months later something else has taken its place. And you know the thing is still going on, but you don't have as much access to the information. In other words, we're a culture today that has an awareness of things we may have never had an awareness of, but we also have what I would call a kind of short memory span about things that are happening in our world. Not only are we challenged in that in terms of kind of the world picture, but divisiveness is also a very important image, I think, for our culture. And no one who follows the political scenario, no matter where you stand in that particular scenario, but doesn't realize that our political sphere is moving to the margins. And in the Catholic Church, we claim that we are a church of the middle ground, right? We're the church that can embrace many, many different ideals. That is quickly becoming a non-starter. The church, like the world in which we live, is becoming increasingly polarized. And we see that in the political sphere. I mean, I can't talk about these things. I'm going to, though. Nobody can shut me up. That's the problem. The problem that we have is that all of our political world today is operating on rhetoric. We're not operating on the facts and the way in which we can move forward. We're operating on who can make, no matter which side you're on, who can make the loudest noise and who can achieve some goal that's basically going to keep the person in office. And I think it was very interesting last week. There was the story in the news about this group of leaders from both parties who are very interested in forming a third party of the middle ground. And I had to say, good. I mean, that sounds like the way to go. But what happened to people that were kind of in the middle ground on the two sides? What happened to cooperation? So when you look at for example, what's happening in Congress, the arguments are not based upon the merits of the argument. The arguments are based upon which side you're on. And if you can't vote to give milk to hungry babies if you're on this side, no matter how compelling an argument might be. Anyway, these are things that there's some way in which our culture has lost the ability to nuance things. And I really feel that that's an important piece. That's also true in the church. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Likewise, we have a lot of economic trials. Every day is filled with this economic news. Or we have a lot of trials with the environment, and people who are, and in which environmental concerns are not about what's right and what's wrong, it's about what side I'm on. And I can't be for this environmental concern if I'm on this side of the aisle. And so again, this development of the edge mentality, no matter which side you're on, has become one of the problems. This is especially true, I believe, in the church today. There's very little middle ground in Catholic life today. Very little middle ground. And this is something that has been observed for the past several years, particularly in my line of work among priests and new priests. And I cannot tell you, almost every single day, there will be a discussion about the difference between older priests and younger priests. Now, I used to be a younger priest, but now I'm an older priest. So I used to stand up for the younger priests because, frankly, in my day, this was the same argument. The older priests were like, what's wrong with these new guys? Why are they this way? What are they doing? Why are they thinking like this? It's exactly the same argument that we're hearing today. And what's interesting is the segregation of priest groups from younger to older, and they can be observed in 1,000 ways, is unable to reconcile itself with the thought that, well, that group may be right about some things. So what we have are two sides of priestly life, and I would say church life, two sides of church life that cannot recognize the validity of the other side, no matter which side they're on. And so we had the case this is maybe a few years ago, but I'll never forget, and it just keeps coming into my mind all the time. We had a bishop, not from this area. No, he really wasn't. No, I'm serious, he wasn't. Not from around here, anywhere around here, or even this region. But we had this bishop who literally told his presbyterate, young and old, that the solution to the church's divisiveness was the death of the old priests. And I'm like, no, that would wipe out our alumni group, so that would be no good. But but there's thought like that in the church, and it's either or, always either or, and never both and never a willingness on the part of any group to listen to the other group. And so the middle of the road has become abandoned. And this divisiveness extends not only to the priesthood, but also to other ministerial groups, and it extends to the laity. I recently had a request from two things that happened. And, I have nothing to say whatsoever about the so-called traditional Mass, nothing to say. But it was interesting. First of all, I don't know if anybody saw the story today on the Diocese of Arlington. Arlington, Virginia has traditionally been one of the most conservative dioceses in the country. They had over 30 parishes that celebrated the traditional Latin Mass, so-called. They can't say that anymore. And the bishop this week has put an end to that. Basically, almost universally, there are like 4 parishes that can continue this, but everything else is out. And of course, the Holy Father has dealt with that. Dioceses are dealing with that. I had someone call me the other day and said, we would like to start the traditional Latin Mass in a nearby town. I won't name the town. It was Jasper. Anyway, a layman. And I said, oh, okay. I said, have you talked to the bishop about that? No, we just thought we'd get a priest from St. Meinrad to come and do it. And I said, over my supine corpse, you will. But even the idea of circumventing the official structures, going against what the Holy Father has been teaching now in 2 separate documents, it's just an interesting time in which most people, let me not say most, let me just say 90%. No, I'll go with 87%. Most people really believe that a lot of the church's teachings are up for grabs when they're not, And one of the things I keep saying about our seminarians is I think most of our seminarians, when they come to St. Meinrad, look exactly like that demographic. My job is to get them away from the demographic and to become real people. And that means kind of pushing them not toward the other side, but pushing them into the middle of the road. And I think I've said this I say this all the time. The thing about for 15 years in this job is you keep repeating yourself. But if you do it in 6-year cycles, chances are nobody's heard it before. And so, but I was saying this the other day, it says all of our seminarians come in that demographic. And then, here I am. Okay, and now I'm going to move. Now I'm going to do it just to irritate you. All of our seminarians come into that demographic, but I don't want them to be a part of a demographic. I want them to be themselves. I want to know who they are. I want to see what they want, not to live into some model that they think they have to live into, no matter what that model is. But I also depend upon all of the priests, for example, in a diocese or in other places, to also help them move, not to reinvent them, but to help them move. And the stories that I hear from some of our alumni and from some parishioners are really heartbreaking. But one thing I have noticed, and I'm quite taken with this idea, is that, you know, a lot of our bishops are very interested in St. Meinrad graduates because they can work. They're not about, you know, setting an ideal or an ideology and moving it in place. They really are about work. And, you know, the abbot yesterday, God bless him, poor thing, having to preach on the 5 of us, or 6 of, how many were there? I don't even know. There were 6, right? 5. There were 5 of us celebrating Jubilees yesterday. I'm the youngest, which tells you something. And one thing he said, when he got to me, he said, Father Denis is a practical person. And I thought about that. I'm like, okay. I am. You know, as I said to somebody, I said, I used to be a theologian, and now I worry about the roof, you know. But there's something about practicality. You don't disdain the ideas. You don't move away from the importance of things like liturgical celebration or whatever it may be. But likewise, you have to be practical. You have to meet people where they are. You know, you can't set these ideals in your parish, for example, that no one can meet, including you, and then get upset when no one is meeting the ideals. No one meets the ideals. We're all sinners. We all have problems. We all have questions. You know, some of us do these things and some of us do not do these. And anyway, I'll talk about that later. I feel like this guy in the picture. I really do someday. Well, I'm better groomed than he is. So. But we live in a divided church today. Whether we like that, we don't like that. I'm sure we don't. I mean, nobody likes it. But one of the things I think that is essential for success, and particularly for the leaders, but also for people in parishes, is to be able to be in the middle of the road, to be able to look to either side, to appreciate both sides, and then be thankful you're in the middle of the road. You know, one of the students once said to me, you know, Father, if you walk in the middle of the road, you're going to get run over. And I'm like, bring it on. Bring it on. So that's where we are. The second thing I would say that the church needs to attend to today in terms of trouble is the abuse crisis. The abuse crisis has not gone away because of COVID. You know, and the one thing I would say about COVID, and I'll talk more about that in depth in a minute, is that it has in some ways been like a fog that has obscured our church's life. How's this? Is that better? Big old Wizard of Oz head. That would be fun. That is to say, there are lots of challenges in church life that COVID has kind of put a fog in front of that we can't really see those anymore. That does not mean they're not there. And I think one of the problems that we can encounter in the church is when we lose track of the things upon which we should continue to focus, right? We should continue to focus on. We lose track of that because we're focusing on something else. You know, it's like for those who have children or grandchildren, it's like, you know, you spend so much time focusing on one of them that the rest of them are running wild in the streets. And that's kind of how it is with the various issues we deal with in the church. If we don't keep them all in front of us, then some of them are going to start running wild in the streets. And I would say the abuse crisis is an example of this. We're not dealing with it well. We're still not dealing with it well. No matter where we stand. And I am continuously enthralled by this ideal of how the Dallas Charter deals with the abuse crisis, or how it's calling our diocese to deal with the abuse crisis. We're dealing with it at some level and not dealing with it at other levels. I think many dioceses still find themselves getting into situations in which it's not so different from 1975 or 1980. And these become questions that we can't stop asking, And so I look, for example, at our formation programs. I look every year, we do a kind of an audit of our celibacy formation program together in one place. We are investigating all of the different kind of things we need to begin to highlight more. Perhaps with some things we don't need to highlight as much, what we need to push out, what we need to pull back. And these things, they require continuous kind of thought. And I wonder if the church today is giving that same continuous thought, particularly to the abuse crisis. And I don't think so. I think we still have a double standard in our church. So a priest can be accused and they're out. A bishop can be accused and they get fight. I don't know. It's above my pay grade in some ways, but it doesn't keep me from thinking about it. And then just the last thing just to mention is COVID. It's interesting when we begin looking at demographics, First of all, what happened in 2020? What happened at the beginning of that crisis in March? For example, in March of 2020, we sent everybody home. We isolated everybody. My poor administrative assistant, Karen, who is so long-suffering. She is so long-suffering, and I say that in the most genuine way, mainly because she's sitting here, which I find very interesting. I ask her, why in the hell are you coming to my presentation? And you hear me go on all the time. Anyway, doesn't matter. But she was bringing us literally our stuff from the outside, and she would leave it, and we would go and pick it up in an isolated spot, out in the woods. And how long did that went on? For months, And so we would send in our orders to Walmart. She would send in the orders. She would go pick them up. She would come back. She'd leave them in the woods. We would come. I remember in the early days, you remember all of this stuff. In the early days, we were spraying down the mail every day. And they sprayed it so much they couldn't read to whom the letter was addressed. It was addressed to someone weeping because this thing was running down. We did that every day. We were so cautious and so nervous, and you couldn't go to the mailroom, and faculty couldn't teach in public. It's crazy. And now it's like, you got COVID? Okay, well, good. We'll do what you do. And of course, all of that has changed, vaccination scenarios, everything. But the problem was, of course, that our church went offline, and then it went online. And I said, one of the greatest challenges I think we're facing right now is, in many places, not every place, but in many places, is getting people to return to church. They became quite accustomed to going to Mass in their living room and in their underwear. Jack knows because he was doing it. And eating their bagel, which wasn't very well prepared necessarily, and eating their bagel with a newspaper in their underwear, and you flip around, right? So I want to go to the beginning of the Mass in Omaha, but I'll go for the homily in Toronto, and I'll come back to, And so, in other words, all of this is going on, and we become quite accustomed to it. And my fear with this, and this relates to another issue, my fear with this is that for many of our Catholics, not all, but for many of our Catholics, particularly those who I would say are kind of marginal, and mostly because they don't belong to one group or the other, many of our Catholics, will they return to church? Will our ministries become invigorated against? And most of the Catholics, let me not say most, let me say many of the Catholics who are very like watching their television Mass may not know the difference between watching Mass on television and going to Mass. And it's not the same thing. We know that. We know it's not the same thing, but some people don't know that, And I think it's very important, and I think one of the things we need to really concentrate on is when we had masses for shut-ins, that was a great thing, and it is a great thing. But having masses that are continuously televised that encourage people not to go back to church, that's problematic. And not necessarily explaining to them why it's problematic. So these become some of the issues. And I'm hoping that as COVID begins to settle again, although I had to put out some new guidelines yesterday, day before, for looking at coming back for the fall, whatever. It's all done. But this is trouble. This is trouble for us. So, the divided church, the abuse crisis and its continued impact, and some real, I think, after effects of COVID, which we may not even have seen yet. These become questions. All of these lead to questions of trouble in ourselves. And you notice I haven't listed any bullet points here, because I do believe this question of the trouble in ourselves can be rampant in different places. I want you just to think about, this is not time for sharing. It's not time for sharing, Jack. I want you to think about this question. What is the status of my faith today as opposed to the status of my faith 25 years ago? Where am I today? I was looking at an article just this morning, and the interesting question that was being asked in this article was, have priests lost their faith? And it was questioning this thing that I talk about a lot. I don't know that I have a good reason to do it, to think about it, but have we lost our faith in trying to keep things just in line? Have we lost our faith in terms of balancing the books? Or have we lost our faith in terms of just trying to make sure that the parish isn't falling apart, the school remains open? I always give that example of the seminarian who leaves here very full of energy, very full of faith, but comes back 1 or 2 years later, and his faith is struggling because he's become so inundated in the practical. And so this article is very interesting because it asks that question. Have priests become so practically minded that they no longer have room in their own lives for faith? And I think that's an important question to ask. I think it's an important question for priests to ask. I think it's an important question for lay people to ask. I think it's an essential question for all of us to ask, is whether or not we continue to have the same degree of faith, not the same kind of faith, but the same degree of faith that we had years ago. Or has our faith diminished as we become immersed in various kinds of practicality? And some people would say, no, my faith is growing every day. And I say, good for you. But for some, I don't know that it's the many, but for some, the question becomes rather pronounced. And I'm always amazed to see, I'm amazed at two things. One thing, I'm amazed at married people. And I'm like, they've been married for 50 years, they've raised their families, they have lovely grandchildren, it's all blah, blah, blah. And then they're like, I'm getting divorced, we're getting divorced. I'm like, oh, really? I said, why after 50? You think after 50 years you just hang on, hang on to the bitter end. But I'm getting a divorce. I said, we've grown apart. I said, you've grown apart? I think the same model, though, applies to some priests. How you get to 50 years or 40 or 30 or 25, you get to that length of time and you're like, where is the vigor of my youth? Where is the joy of my younger years? Where is the faith that I had? Where was what happened to the honeymoon? And I was, the honeymoon for married couples sometimes ends the day they return from the honeymoon. For priests and for religious, it sometimes ends whenever, but not for all. And so one of the things I think is important for us in ourselves is to be able to continuously identify the struggles, to deal with them, and to continue to grow in faith. So here, I just want to mention how we can find God, what this means. First of all, I would see that the essential component of this is a commitment to prayer. So all of the priests in the room, this is not sharing time. All of the lay people in the room, it's likewise not sharing time. What is your commitment to prayer every day? And I'm not just talking about time frame, and I'm not just talking about the style, or I'm not talking about the means, Liturgy of the Hours, for example. I'm talking about your commitment to communication with God. And it's invariable that one of the reasons people's faith begins to be diminished is because they're no longer communicating with the object of their affection. And it's the same in marriage, right? I mean, you're married, and then one day you discover we haven't spoken to each other all day long. And some of you say, that's so romantic. That's not necessarily romantic. You know, I know a lot of some couples who may not speak to each other all day long, and I would say, you know, that's all right, because they have this connection, this bond. I know some couples that argue with each other all day long, and I think that's all right too, because that's how they express affection. The same can be true, though, of our relationship with God. I would say if we're not speaking to God all day, it's for two reasons. One is we've forgotten about God, but the other reason is that we're always in constant communication, you know. And that's what I say about priests. You know, priests can be very, very self-deceptive, and, well, let's call it liars. You know, they say, oh, my work is my prayer, or I'm constantly praying, so therefore I don't need to pray the Liturgy of the Hours. And I'm like, lay people, priests, it's the same personal dynamic, really. You know, and sometimes we can be arguing with God all day and all night, and that's very healthy. It's indifference, really, that becomes the problem, when we're indifferent to the divine reality in our lives, when it's not an issue. And that can be true for lay people. It's also very true sometimes for priests. We're very indifferent. We can be very indifferent. You know, and so we're doing very well at one point, and then we suddenly find ourselves going through that drive-through at Wendy's 6 or 7 times a day, hoping that, you know, that cute little thing in the window will give us a little wink the next time we get a Frosty. And I'm like, no, Father, you've already had too many Frosties to ever get a wink. How can we find God? Commitment to learning. You know, and I go back to the priests, but also to the lay folks. What is our commitment to expressing a learning relationship? Are we learning more? Not only about God, but also about ourselves. Are we learning more about the world in which we live? Okay, this is time for the true confessions. So I do a lot of reading, as you know. I read a lot. And Karen, she can tell you, somehow I have provided Amazon with their major kind of source of income. Am I wrong? No. You know, so you're constantly reading, you're constantly doing things, but you can also find yourself getting into little problematic behaviors. I'm not talking about, you know, watching the porn or anything, although the definition of pornography should be quite wide. I've recently, for a while, I was on the YouTube, and I love the YouTube. But you know what I love on the YouTube? I love stories of abandoned animals who have been adopted. What that says about me, I do not know. I do know what it says about me. But you know, this poor little pit bull was dying in the streets, and now he's been adopted, and he's so happy and is friends with a duck. You know, these and cat videos. I love cat videos, you know, especially cats and asparagus. Did you know that cats don't like asparagus? Who cares, right? And so these are and I love those. This is true confessions time. I'm never going to get through this thing. This is true confessions time. The videos I love the most are the 3 German shepherds that are given different treats by the owner, and they have those little thought bubbles above their heads that tell you what they're thinking about. You know, so they first get a yummy piece of chicken, and they're like, chicken, yummy, yummy, yummy. And then they'll get like a piece of asparagus, and they'll be like, we don't like asparagus. Anyway, lately, and this is awful. This is awful. I feel so small, which is very rare because I very seldom feel small. TikTok. I'm into the TikTok. Do you know the TikTok, they do these stupid 3-minute videos, and that's it. And they mean nothing. And you're like, okay. You're like, what did I have for dinner? Or, you know, what am I going to do today? It's like, I don't care, but you keep going. What's next? What's next? Anyway, this is all crazy. But I got stuck on it because it was on the YouTube. So I'm beginning to think that YouTube may be the most problematic thing in my life. And then I begin to think, if that's the most problematic thing, I'm probably doing okay. But what is our commitment to learning beyond the internet, beyond the sound bites, beyond the TikTok, whatever that might be? What is our commitment to learning in a real sense? And not only kind of our fields, but also the larger sphere. What is our commitment to fiction? What is our commitment to modern literature? You know, what is it going to be? If you don't have a reading plan, I would suggest that you begin to think about that. Our commitment to the sacraments. What do you think is if I walk from here to here, I'm still okay? Okay. You're the president of what class? Well, 97. You're a very young person, aren't you? It's amazing. 25. Anyway, doesn't matter. 25 years. Anyway. Where was I? Oh, a commitment to learning, but also a commitment to the sacraments. You know, what are we learning about the sacraments, for example? How are we engaging this question of the sacraments in our own lives? How are we going to continue to grow in our sacramental life? You know, and I'm amazed to hear stories like this. Children preparing for First Communion, parents dropping them off for their First Communion class. And let me tell you, that's a very interesting class to go talk to. I do have the opportunity frequently to talk to First Communion classes. They are much more engaging than seminarians. They are. I mean, they haven't asked. 7 and 8-year-olds haven't asked the question, what's an appropriate question to ask, like adults? And so they ask you anything, you know, and that's fun. You know, that's a much better learning model. But, you know, parents take their children to sacrament class, they drop them off. They don't even take them to church. You know, they don't go to church. They're going to receive their First Communion and probably not be seen again. You know, what is that? How do we understand that? Why is First Communion a thing, but regular church going is not a thing? You know, what is our commitment to the sacraments? Do we understand? And I go back to that study that was done several years ago, which I find very interesting, among practicing Catholics who say they don't understand what the Eucharist is. They don't understand the idea of real presence. They don't understand. And I would say many of our Catholics today, not all, but many, don't really understand the sacrament. I'm not saying that because it's a mystery. It is, but, I'm not saying that. That's not the answer to everything. I'm saying it because we're completely under-catechized. In so many places, we're completely under-catechized in the church. And this is a place that we need to consider that. We need to consider what our commitment to the sacraments is, not only in terms of participation, but in terms of understanding. You ready, Agnes? This is it. The commitment to the domestic church. The domestic church, I'm going to say it, and you're like, what in the hell is domestic church? The domestic church is not going to church at home. It's not sitting in your underwear. The domestic church is the future of Catholicism because it is the authentic past of Catholicism. I'm not only talking about the first 3 centuries of church life when everything was happening in the home, but I'm talking about the real understanding of a culture of Christianity, a culture of Catholicism that is embedded in home life. It's an essential component to home life. And that's an important thing for us to consider. What is the quality of church expression in the home? What is the quality of church expression in our family life? I was having a talk with a very wise theologian very recently, earlier this morning. That is to say, my administrative assistant. And we were talking about the fact that most families have almost no domestic life, much less domestic church life. People aren't eating together. People aren't engaging with each other at home. Everybody's going their separate ways. And that may be true, but what is the quality of this engagement that people have? And the question then becomes a lack of developed domestic life, particularly among children, for children, leads to a kind of lack of commitment and lack of focus for life as adults. Not only do they not develop a domestic life of their own when they become parents or families, but they also cannot focus on things in the larger sphere. And the one thing that we go back to again in looking at the younger generation is they have such a very narrow, not only frame of reference, but also ability to focus like 4 minutes tops on anything. And if it's TikTok, like 4 seconds. What's going on in the home? How are we understanding that? Oh my gosh. I have like 90 slides and we're on number 2. The next one is a commitment to culture. That is to say, to embedding culture among us. And so often this becomes a kind of a point of discussion, a point of controversy in the church when we don't realize it. When we look at the segregation of church life today, that is to say the left and the right, or however we want to put it together, most of it is geared around the culture. Most of our liturgical wars in the church today are geared around the culture of the church, the culture of the liturgy, the culture of our society. What should this culture be like? What should the church's culture be like? And it has nothing to do with theology. It really has nothing to do with anything. And I'll give you the perfect example of this. And I'm so committed to this ideal, it may be completely, it's not false. I usually get things right. No response from you. It's not false. I just really believe this. When we're looking at the traditional so-called Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo today, people are not concerned in general, not universally, but in general, people are not really concerned about the rite itself. Because I don't think that many people, not everyone, but I don't think there are many people who understand that there is any kind of liturgical distinction and there may not be. Linguistic distinction, there may not be. Difference between these two forms, use the old expression. What they don't realize is that what many people, not everyone, but many people are responding to is the cultural expression in the liturgy as opposed to any technical or theological difference between the two. In other words, it's how they're celebrated that becomes kind of the key to understanding the bias on either direction. And this is a question I think that we can't get people to consider. And it was in this article that was in the news this morning about the Diocese of Arlington, and said that the bishop is not saying you can't do this or this or this, which is permitted in the new rite, 50 years old, is permitted in the new rite. He's saying you can't do the old rite. You can do the new rite even so far as it almost looks exactly like, from a cultural point of view, the old rite. Anyway, those are questions that we still haven't answered. And finally, I would say, how can we find God? We can find God by our commitment to the world. By our commitment to the world. Are we committed to this planet? And I'm not trying to get into a political argument about culture and climate change or whatever, but I'm saying, are we committed to this planet? Or do we use our environment in a way that's just self-serving? That's not a political stance. That's a stewardship stance from a Christian point of view. It's also saying something about God's creation. You know, it's very intriguing. Are we committed to the world in which we live to the point that we're willing to make sacrifices for that world? Or are we only committed to our personal comfort as we move forward in life? And you know, this becomes a major theme from a point of eschatology. Do we care about what this world is going to be like 100 years from now? Because let me tell you, none of you are going to be there. And I personally do not plan to be even celebrating my 50th Jubilee. I'm saying if God is good, He will take me to Himself before that. But I'll probably still be the rector. Anyway, are we committed to the world in which we live? Or are we just committed to making our own lives here right now comfortable, and we're not anticipating what we're going to leave behind for those in the future? Okay, now look, I have like 90 more slides. Look at all that. That was wonderful. And I spent a lot of time looking for pictures too. It doesn't matter. I think, though, it might be good to stop at this point and ask if anybody would like questions or maybe some ideas to ponder. Any questions or thoughts? And not how come you didn't get to play golf this morning. That's not my responsibility. Yeah. I'm not talking about, yeah, all of you were taught to be countercultural. I'm not talking so much about that kind of notion of culture. What I'm talking about is abiding culture and things that we can have a commitment to. Truth, goodness, beauty, the ways in which those things are manifested in our world are things we should have a commitment to. There are also things that can become very much a part of the various cultures in which we live. But my experience right now is that there's very little kind of focus on truth, goodness, and beauty, particularly in their physical manifestations. Now, I raise the issue because culture, the way we understand culture, is really incarnational. In other words, we don't like cultural things like art just for the sake of, being separated from the rest of the world that doesn't like art. We like it because it enhances our understanding of the world. Good music makes a difference that bad music does not. And that's what I mean. I'm talking about a much larger sphere. And there is room for counterculturalism, especially when the culture with which we find ourselves is not a culture that promotes culture, but only promotes anti-culture. So it's good to be anti-cultural if by being anti-cultural we are promoting authentic culture as opposed to false culture. And those are things that I don't think a lot of people, particularly younger people, are able to deal with. What's the difference between just what's out there and what ought to be out there? Or what's the difference between what's out there and what I need to attend to? And it goes back to this whole question of, what should I be looking at on the internet and how should I be involved in various things? Or should I be watching TikTok videos or dog videos? I don't know, but the dogs are so cute. Anyway, there are a lot of these videos with the 3 German Shepherds, and I would highly recommend that you look into it. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts? Yes. I think that the synod process, as it's outlined, it's envisioned, is exactly where we need to go. My question is how many people in the room today have been involved in some aspect of the development of the synod process? A goodly number, not a whole lot. My question is, I think it's uneven. In some dioceses, it's moving forward. In some dioceses, it's not. I would say there are probably some dioceses that don't care if it moves forward. I would say some are really kind of focusing on it. And that's the question. I think somehow it has been stifled perhaps by some of the problems that we've had with gathering for COVID. It's hard to have a synod when you have to do it on the the Zoom. Oh, I hate the Zoom. I hate it and I love it. I hate it because I don't like being on the Hollywood squares. And I love it because it keeps meetings short. Anyway, I think it's running the gamut. And my concern is, are we going to get to the actual synod and not have a lot of quality evidence because of a lack of focus in some places on the pre-synod process? So I would say that's true. But it does address the questions I'm asking. Yeah. If we allow it to, if we can make it address them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. I agree with you, and I'm concerned. Here's my point. I think there are 2 ways in which that question can be addressed. And I know that it can be addressed in those ways because I know I've experienced it being addressed in those ways. I think there are some, for example, and I just use the seminary as an example here, but it doesn't just apply to seminary. There are some seminaries that won't address questions of relating to sexuality. I'm not talking about just sexual orientation. I'm talking about anything relating to physical affectivity. And they say things like this, and I know they say things like this because I talk to their seminarians and they say, this is what my seminary says. You should never talk about sex with your formation director or the rector. you should only talk about it in the context of confession. That is poison. It's poison. Because it gets into the confessional, but it can't go anywhere from there. You know, my philosophy, and one that I try to instill in people from the very beginning of their time here, is we can talk about anything. You may not want to talk to me about everything, but we can talk about it. We will talk about it. We're always going to challenge, and from our point of view, celibacy formation is about their public identity as much as it is about what they do privately. I said, your sexuality, your sexual identity is your main way of ministering to people, for good or for ill. And I just believe what we see is people who are comfortable with their sexual identity are people who are able to deal with everyone. And people who are uncomfortable with their sexual identity are people who are completely unable to deal with almost anyone. But these are questions that have to be kind of brought home to seminarians at the beginning. And then every aspect of their formation has to reiterate that value. Can things go wrong? Yes, they can. And I've had at least 2 experiences in my time as rector where a person has gone through our seminary and had all of this formation and still there was a problem. But only 2. You know? That I know of. That I know of. But I don't think that there's nothing to be gained in the church today by secrecy and not talking about things and not giving people a format to talk about things. And I just think that's essential. So we're trying to push that agenda forward, but I would say not every seminary is using that particular agenda. And they have a lot more problems, even publicly, than we do. So, yeah. 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 One of my things that I say, I just say a lot of crap. I don't know. I say a lot of stuff. But people pay attention to me anymore. But one of the things I say is, if your investment in a particular rubrical scenario causes you to hate other people, then it's not a value worth preserving. You're on the wrong track. I said, are your particular ideals about the sacraments leading to the end of the sacrament, which is unity, or it is leading to division? And this can be true on either side of the spectrum, right? So as I said last night, one of my goals as rector is to really piss everybody in the seminary off. And I say that only with a slight smile. And that's because I think that everybody should be challenged as much by the sacraments as they are comforted by them. And if you're only getting a sacramental celebration that you find comfortable, that's a problem. But if you're only getting one that causes you to want to fight, that's also a problem. And if you as a priest are leading people to be divided in the church because of the way you celebrate the sacraments, that's a problem. But this requires something, I think, that's essential, which is quality formation for the individual. That is to say, if the priest is formed in a quality way, which means that he's not just pursuing ideological goals, but he's pursuing personal goals for others, then his understanding of the sacraments is going to be fine. But if he's only pursuing ideological goals, then it will not be fine. And these are the things that we have to think about. It's a very tempting scenario to look at the demographic and ideological demographic of young seminarians, particularly new seminarians, and form your formation program around that ideology. Why? Because they're not going to complain. They're going to be perfectly happy. Why? Because you're doing what they like. If you start challenging what they like, which you should, then you're going to begin to have to deal with a little controversy. But as I said in the meeting last night, part of that is also challenging the staff. You know, a bunch of big liberals, that's all right. You know, but they need to be challenged. We need to be challenged too. And we need to meet somewhere in the middle. And if we can find a way to meet in the middle, then the liturgy will not be a divisive ideal. That's a hard thing to do, though. The pastor leads them. The pastor has to lead them. But I find in so many places, again, on both sides of the spectrum, the pastor is the source of division. This can't be. Can't be. You know, as I said, you know, when you're a newly ordained priest, you go into that parish, you need to sit with the people and learn from the people and listen to the people until you have been converted as well as they. But if you go in and start, you know, spreading bullshit all over the place because it's what you like, then you're lost. Not only will they turn off, but you're going to be very frustrated, because why should they do what you say because you've been ordained 15 minutes? Anyway, it's the priest's responsibility, and you know, with the assistance of others, obviously, but the buck stops here. That's in the seminary too. The buck stops here. And I don't make perfect decisions all the time. I would say 99.9% of the time. You know, I don't make perfect decisions all the time. We all live in sinful environments and what have you. But it's what you intend that's very important, even sometimes more important than what you're able to accomplish, at least from a personal spiritual point of view. Yeah, Ben. Yes. Yes, I think that's right. Our task is to be true to. Oh, wait, look. I have these slides. I could have done all these slides. Oh, that would be great. Look, there's the Good Samaritan. He's dead. Look. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But that's exactly the things I'm talking about. You know, our commitment to Christ, and by extension, our commitment to the church, must be. Let me do it this way. Sometimes I will have people come to me in the seminary and they'll say, "What do you think's going on in the church?" What do you mean, what's going on in the church? Are there mice? I don't know what's going on. You know, what do you think? No, you think, is the church going astray? I said, no, the church isn't going astray. What are you, idiot? And sometimes in a parish, somebody will come up to me and they say, "Father, what's going on in the church?" I'm like, "I don't know. What's wrong?" He says, "Is the church going astray?" They're asking from a completely different perspective. And I'll say, "No, the church isn't going astray." And he said, everybody in the church seems pissed off today. That's not their words. Sometimes it is. But those are my words. Everybody in the church seems angry today. Everybody in the church seems upset about where the church is. I said, "Oh, that might be a good thing." You know, tension is the key to successful discipleship, whether that's on a personal level or whether that's on a parish level or whether that's in the church. If everybody's perfectly happy, then chances are you're on the edge one way or the other. And those things become questions that we have to keep asking. You know, the key to successful discipleship is to continually ask the questions and not get stuck somewhere. That's idolatry. But if we continue to ask the questions and don't get bogged down in finding a comfort zone, then we're going to be fine. The church has and does make mistakes, but ultimately, that's where it's somewhere we have to put our faith. You know, if we don't put our faith in the institution, then we have to consider that we've moved away from the ideals of Catholicism. Then one more question. One more. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. You and Carl Rahner. Yeah, that's exactly what Rahner said. He said, you know, the question of the church today and its faults is not all too human. The question of the church today and its faults is not human enough. You know, we've been given the perfect example of humanity in Christ, and we've been given the ability to live it. And that's where we have to really kind of put a lot of our spiritual energy is, am I willing to live the example of Christ as is presented to us, not only in the scriptures, but also in the church, and not rely upon a very half-hearted kind of idea that, oh no, well we're broken and fractured and all too human. You know, and I don't believe that. I do believe mistakes will continue to be made, but part of that being human enough is the ability to recognize something as a problem and a mistake and not as a norm that we should be following. Anyway. Yeah. Right. Right. You should be on the January 6th committee. Good. Well, thank you all. Thanks for coming this morning. Thanks for being here for the course of these days of reunion. The Lord be with you. May Almighty God bless you, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Okay, go away.